Good morning, everyone. It's Throwback Thursday. And wow, here we are at the end of 2020. What a year. It's definitely going to be one we all remember and talk about in the future. Maybe not in entirely positive terms, but it has been memorable. One thing that has been not entirely, but just slightly overlooked this year, in the midst of everything else that was going on, is that this was a census year. Today is actually the deadline for the Census Bureau to deliver apportionment counts, which determines each state's representation in Congress to the president. And hopefully all of our community members got counted, because the census is incredibly important for the benefit of our county and its residents in the near future, as well as being a valuable historical tool for future generations. The Census Bureau does estimate the final response rate for the 2020 census to be 99.9% of residents counted both nationwide and in the state of Kentucky, so that's great. Obviously, 100% is the goal, but 99.9% means that few people, if anyone, was missed. The United States Census is taken every 10 years, starting in 1790. When the United States Constitution was written, the Founding Fathers included a provision for a census to be taken each decade as a way to determine how many people were living in the country and were, thus, being represented by the government. These numbers were then used to determine how many seats in Congress each state deserved for adequate representation. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson led the effort for the very first United States Census back in 1790, and the importance of the count was immediately obvious. Prior to that census, Congress was made up of only 65 people. The 1790 census led the government to increase representation to 105 people. Now, of course, Congress includes 435 men and women, 100 senators, and 335 representatives in the House. But as important as census data is for determining congressional representation, that's only the tip of the iceberg. The census also helps determine planning and funding for agencies and programs. And at Thistle Cottage, we find the census to be an absolutely wonderful tool for genealogical research. Since the idea of the census is that every resident is counted, theoretically, you should be able to find any of your predecessors in the census from the years during which they were alive. In practice, of course, that's not necessarily the case. People did get missed sometimes, and sometimes they can just be difficult to find. But still, if you are able to locate a family member in the census, you'll have their name, age, approximate location, or at least the town in which they lived, other household members, including spouses, children, and sometimes even extended family, and sometimes additional information, such as their occupation, their education level, where their parents were born, and more. These points of data can be a huge help in filling out a family tree. Not all census data is immediately available, though, so that is something to take into consideration when you are working on genealogical research. Specific census data, including all those names and dates I just mentioned, is embargoed for a period of 72 years. That means it won't be released until 72 years after the data was collected. The idea is to protect the privacy of those who were living at the time and would be listed on that census. While there may still be a small number of listed people living 72 years later, the majority of those listed on that census would likely have passed on before the data is released to the public. While the Census Bureau does release broad, anonymized data from more recent censuses, such as regional population and demographics, each person's specific information will be protected for the duration of that waiting period. Because of this 72-year waiting period, the 1940 census is the most recent to have been released to the public. The 1950 census will be released in 2022, probably in April, which is when the Bureau normally releases that information to the public. And this year's census will not be released until 2092. We are also missing some census data from years past. Unfortunately, a 1921 fire at the United States Commerce Department building, where the data was stored, destroyed most of the 1890 census. Small parts of the information was salvaged, but most of it was lost, so we only have scattered bits from across the country, and unfortunately, none of the census information from Kentucky survived that fire. That was a huge loss to genealogists. Personally, I have family members who were in transition during the late 1800s, and the information from the 1890 census would almost certainly be incredibly helpful to me in tracking down some of those family members, but we just don't have that data. Fortunately, that is the only major loss of census information our country has suffered over the 230 years we've been collecting that data, and we have learned from that and other similar disasters. We now store information in multiple locations and in multiple formats, so one mishap won't wipe everything out. Even at Thistle Cottage, we have multiple ways to access census data. We have copies of the state census information on microfilm from 1810 through 1930, and these books in front of me contain paper copies of census data for Muhlenberg County for the years between 1810 and 1920. These books only cover the local area, so they won't be as useful to residents whose families came from outside of Muhlenberg County. However, if you're descended from a family that made their home here prior to 1920, these books may be useful to you. And sometimes it's easier to have a paper copy to look at instead of trying to read what's on a screen, which is where the books come in handy. Or maybe you're like me and just enjoy flipping through to see if you recognize any family names. Muhlenberg County Public Libraries also provides access to Ancestry.com for our patrons. Every census currently available from the National Archives, where census data is now primarily stored, is available in its entirety on Ancestry.com. Ancestry also has an index and a powerful search engine, so you can simply type in the name of the family member you're looking for, and the site will show you every record in which that name appears. It's not fail-proof. There are some errors in the transcription of these historic documents, where either the documents have been damaged or were simply misread by the person who entered the data, but it does often make it much easier to search for genealogical information, especially for family members that appear in multiple years of the census. Currently, Ancestry is provided through KYVL, Kentucky Virtual Library. If you've been following our Tutorial Tuesday videos, that name will be familiar to you. We've been sharing videos helping people learn more about KYVL and how to access various resources provided there. Ancestry is available through KYVL as part of a collaboration with the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives. We believe this arrangement will be in place at least through next spring, although the official expiration date is not entirely clear at this point. As long as the service remains available as part of KYVL, however, patrons can access Ancestry from the safety and comfort of their own homes. You can find a link to KYVL on our website's online resources page. Just call us at the library to get the proper login info. Once you log into KYVL, you'll find Ancestry Library Edition on the A to Z list of resources provided as part of KYVL, or in the Databases drop-down menu. For more information about how to access KYVL and use the many other resources provided there, you can find our Tutorial Tuesday videos on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Even if the arrangement with KDLA expires and Ancestry is no longer available as part of Kentucky Virtual Library, Thistle Cottage staff will still be able to access Ancestry on our patients' behalf, so our local genealogists will still have access to that valuable information. That's all for today's Throwback Thursday video. We hope you've enjoyed this week's video, as well as those we've released over the past 6 months. We will be continuing to produce more Throwback Thursday content in the new year, but in the meantime, have a safe and happy New Year's Eve, and we'll see you in 2021.